Good morning, everybody. Nice to see everyone. Everybody having a good time in Austin? Yes? Yeah? Me too. It's great to be back here. And it's nice to be able to be in person with you all. And it's great to be joined by my really good friend, Scott Pulsipher, who is the president and CEO of Western Governors University. And I think he's the perfect person to help us kick off this half day where we can really spend together to reimagine and think big about what the future of workforce education can look like, right? So I encourage all of you to really step out of your day to day and to really imagine with us, right? And think creatively and think big and think bold. And hopefully we can kind of come away from today with some great action steps that can help us all move forward in new ways. And so, Scott, the last time you and I did a session like this, it was October of 2019. We were in New York City in front of a group of corporate leaders that Kat Ward, who I believe is here somewhere, pulled together, and Laura Roberts. And at that time, we were talking about the rapid pace of change that was happening kind of in the education and workforce sector. And little did we know what was going to hit us just about 5 or 6 months after that. So as you think about, kind of where we are today now in March 2020 and what we've been through as a field and as a country in the past 2 years, how do you kind of think about where we are today and where do we go from here?
That long ago, I didn't have any gray hair, by the way. I think I was no wrinkles. Things were looking really up, and then that thing hit. One, I'm grateful that we're kind of on the other side of this, but I don't think there's ever been a greater catalyst for disruption in the talent supply chain. So I think to your point is, we are certainly grappling in post-secondary education as a whole. We're certainly grappling with the fact that there's 1 million individuals who are no longer participating in those educational pathways, and that's a real issue because it makes you wonder, where are they going? Because the fact is that the workforce itself, the demands in it have only elevated and escalated, if you will. And that's really probably on two fronts, is that we're significantly short in terms of the total number of individuals that are participating in the workforce, particularly here in the U.S. And on top of that, the talent, the skills that are needed in that workforce are still being now amplified in terms of readying ourselves for the future of work and how technology is disrupting so many things about that. There's two things I think that are notable that I would say are really happening at an accelerating pace. And that is the skills. You can see that. I think Sean Gallagher out of Northeastern did some really interesting research around this. There's other things that have been highlighting the fact that already today more than a third of employers are rapidly shifting their hiring practices towards skills. Not necessarily ignoring credentials, but they're basically shifting more towards skills as the determinant as to whether they're finding actually the talent they need for the workforce. And it makes you wonder then, where are those individuals going to actually acquire those skills? Because if you see losing 1 million individuals in enrollment in higher education, they're going somewhere. And so I think you're starting to see a rapid emergence of alternative pathways to work. And there's some really, compelling entities out there, whether it's the Coursera's and Udacity's, but also the ones like SV Academy and others and boot camps. That are actually pathways for individuals to acquire those skills that they need for that first kind of high resiliency job that they want to get into. I think that's also further amplified by our friend's research, Joe Fuller at Harvard Business School, who's actually done a lot of work around the hidden worker. If employers do want to find the talent they need to start thinking differently about the talent pools rather than doing you need a degree, you start looking for that on the basis of skills. And that's rapidly adjusting. Meanwhile, last thing I'll maybe point out in this regard is that online education or technology-enabled learning, that is here to stay. As lousy as it was for most students who had to rapidly shift in the latter part of the winter term, I guess, of 2020. Even as not as poor as it was, one thing that everyone realized pretty quickly is that they love the flexibility that affords them. They now know that they can reach and engage with instructors and with their learning resources and everything else in ways that it doesn't require them to be on a campus in a classroom at a set time, et cetera. And so I think institutions of learning are now investing much more heavily in how do you leverage technology to improve the quality of the learning, both in terms of the relevancy to the work they're pursuing, but also the personalization of the experience so that more individuals from all the diverse backgrounds can actually be successful in attaining the skills that they need for the work.
And I really feel that you and your work at WGU, you're really, I think, an outlier when it comes to a higher education institution that is really going deep in the area of skills, right? You've worked, with folks at the federal level around policy around this. The Open Skills Network is up and running. What would you say to your counterparts, other university presidents? Like, how can they be doing more to make this a reality and kind of shift the traditional narrative?
Yeah, that's going to be a real challenge. There's a reason why I think WGU has been at the forefront of that is because we are a competency-based educational model. So it is in our curriculum design, in our assessments design, et cetera, we've had to be very clear about what are the learning outcomes that you expect to achieve in completing this course in this program. And we've mapped those learning outcomes directly to the skills that are needed in the jobs and the workforce that are being pursued, such that we know that when an individual is completing those courses in their program, that they're actually deemed proficient in the skills that are needed in the work. That is the work that I think most institutions have to undertake. That will be a challenge for most of them. Why? Because you have mostly a faculty-centered approach to the curriculum development. Each individual faculty has their freedom to actually design their syllabus and their course and their assessment the way they want to. They teach it the way they want to, such that when you complete a course, for the individual, it's not well known as to exactly what should I be able to articulate as the skills that I now possess having completed that course. But that is something that can be enabled by technology. There are things even out there like the Open Skills Network around the rich skills descriptors that allow institutions and employers to be able to better articulate what is it that an individual should actually have mastery in or proficiency in. An employer can design also and write their job descriptions utilizing those skill descriptors so that in fact that mapping can occur. Having said that, the biggest probably thing that the institutions can do is thinking about how do you leverage technology to improve the quality of the curriculum design, even if you're doing that across hundreds of faculty. How do you enable those faculty with their tools to more clearly define what specifically are the learning outcomes that you expect from this course? How are you going to assess for that? How can we communicate that to the individual? In the same regard, like how do you invest in the technology to personalize that learning so that an individual can not only be in that classroom, but also can access resources and instructional supports when they need it. So it increases the probability that that individual can actually achieve that level of mastery that they need. All that requires technology. And I think like most of us out there today is like we don't distinguish in retail online, offline shopping. It's just retail. We just seek and buy stuff wherever we can buy it. I think in similar fashion, we have to realize that even if an individual's on campus, they're also online. Like everything that we're doing today in learning, in work, in banking, in travel, everything else, like all of that is enabled by technology. And institutions have certainly been recognized as being somewhat behind banking and travel and other places like that in terms of their utilization of their technology to improve the relevancy of the learning that they're achieving and the personalization of the journey so that the probability that each student succeeds goes up.
That's great. Yeah, so building on that, when we think about the need to drive towards equity, and when Secretary Cardona was on stage here yesterday, he was talking about how, we can't build back things that didn't work before, right? And I often feel that traditional systems kind of get stuck like in the status quo because they want to preserve, in my opinion, a lot of things that don't work, right? And that to me, if you want to drive towards equity, you actually need to embrace a certain level of disruption and innovation in order to get to the results that we've been seeking for so long. And so when you think about, innovations that you're kind of like spearheading at WGU or things that you're seeing in the field, what do you think we should be really testing out more in order to have more equitable outcomes?
Yeah, a variety of different things, because I would say let's start simply with a general premise about education, which is it is a path to opportunity. In many ways, it can be viewed more as a means to an end rather than an end in and of itself. It doesn't mean that we're not always gaining more knowledge and skill and ability, et cetera, and you can do that in multiple different ways. But that what we're gaining is actually enabling us to do new things and pursue new opportunities. What we haven't done, particularly as it relates to equity in terms of the structural discrimination that exists, it exists throughout that entire journey. That life cycle of learning to work, that discrimination actually exists everywhere, meaning that you have disparate outcomes in terms of access. It actually starts there, is that so many individuals just simply can't access the learning pathways because they're not affordable, they're time and place-based. There's so many different dimensions around the instructional model too that favor one style versus another in terms of learning. Like, there's so many things that even just related to access that they're not fully accessible to every individual wherever they may be, whoever they may be. Then when you get into the journey itself, is like you start to recognize that if you have barriers that relate to my learning style, or it relates to my affordability, et cetera, and working learner, which is the kind of simple definition that we use at WGU, a working learner, after 8 years, only about 25% of them actually complete and attain the credential they need to be able to go on their pathway forward. And not surprisingly, those are disproportionately represented from low-income backgrounds. You also have a high percentage of those that are students of color. Like, that can't be the case anymore. And so much of this starts because you have selective admissions. And there should be an opportunity for us right now at this time to figure out, like, how do we leverage technology? How do we maybe even think about year-round higher education instead of just 2 terms a year, where you can start dramatically expanding capacity and making accessible pathways into that journey? But even if we did that, we wouldn't have solved everything, because the disparate outcomes also continue to exist. Even for individuals of color who attain a degree, they are not getting hired into the jobs at the same pay levels as their white peers. That's not acceptable. What do we have to do in the hiring practices, the wraparound services that are needed there to better ready individuals for the success there? How do we increase the awareness as to what opportunities are available to you, given the learning that you've acquired? Like, throughout that journey, you have to do that. So let me just end with what we at WGU are trying to do. First and foremost, we're trying to make sure that all the data and research, that when you get to skills, it's all geolocated. Meaning specifically with the jobs, the employers, et cetera, what are the skills that are needed to actually attain the opportunities that are relevant to where you are? And then, given who you are and where you are, what is effectively the mapping that we need to create for you so you can compass yourself from where you are to the opportunities you need? Think of it this way. We start with the opportunity and work backwards. We don't start with the individual and try to push them forward. Like, if these are the opportunities you want to get to, how do I start with who you are and get you to that point? And we're willing to basically invest in all of the wraparound services that are needed to get you from where you are to the opportunities you want to pursue. That kind of compassing, including all the services and support that now allow us to personalize and adapt the whole of WGU for the one student, that is what we're trying to do, because we do not believe that the attainment rate or completion rate or the opportunities that who you are and what you came with and where you're from, et cetera, that is not the determinant of success and your worth. We're trying to make sure that we adapt the whole of WGU so that you can succeed as a student. And that takes it's a massive undertaking, but it's a lot less expensive than continuing to expand campuses or continue to invest in different, like, how do we better invest in technology, personalized learning, et cetera, to increase the outcomes for every individual?
Great. It reminds me, and I'll ask Dan from our team to maybe tweet out a link to this, but just last week, I believe, we issued a new market scan in partnership with Comcast that looks at the providers and the programs and the platforms around the country that are enabling Black learners and workers to move into jobs in digital and tech, and includes a lot of great examples of wraparound supports providers like Scott mentioned. So encourage you all to take a look at that. My last question for Scott is really about leadership. Earlier this week, I had an opportunity to talk with former Governor Deval Patrick of Massachusetts, which was really terrific. He just started leading the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard. And one thing he talked to me that has stuck in my mind all week is that he believes that leaders need to start spending their political capital, not just accumulating it, right? And we're in this moment in time in DC and around the country, right, where we have a lot of accumulation, but not a lot of spending of leadership capital. And Scott, you're on the board of ACE, you're leading a huge institution. I really see you as a leader who is, willing to take the big swings. But what advice do you have for all of us around the country? What should we be thinking about? Where can we be swinging bigger?
Well, I think first and foremost, you have to be really clear about the purpose and mission to which you're leading. This even happened at WGU. Not even 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, we very simply clarified our mission is that our mission is to change lives for the better by creating pathways to opportunity. We have very specifically 3 key results. These didn't exist before WGU. We focus on completion, return, and equity. And if you think about it for us, is like that mission and purpose is very simple, that the promise of education is that if you complete and attain the learning that you require, that it will actually result in opportunity. If that doesn't work, then why are we investing in education? And it has to work for everyone. That's our 3rd key result. Is like who you are and what you bring with you is like those are the determinants of that promise. And that those of us who are engaging in that promise have to be willing to face the challenges that we've created and the barriers that are part of the system that we've had for a century, such that you have to be willing to actually start disrupting the things that are making that promise not work. And quite frankly, it spans a lot of different things. You can just look at the student finance complex and, Secretary Cardona is dealing with this. It's like, let's just deal with the reality that federal student aid, it's not working. It's not keeping a check on the cost of education. It's not helping individuals actually succeed because those who start and don't complete are often worse off than had they never started. Let's deal with that reality. Let's deal with the disparate outcomes that exist in higher education, because if you have a standard model, it's going to serve some really well and not serve everyone else. So why do we have a standard model? How do we think about introducing more flexibility, more designs, et cetera, that increase the likelihood of that promise working for everyone? And I think you have to be really clear about that mission, which, by the way, sometimes also means that you have to speak out on issues that, in fact, work against that mission. And so that may sometimes also force you to kind of deal with, dynamics related to social injustice and the nature of those things. You'll have to deal with the, affordability questions that make state budgets uncomfortable and stuff like that. I'll just give you one example of that. There's a state higher ed system that has about the same amount of full-time enrollment as WGU does. It graduates 22,000 individuals a year. WGU graduated 50,000 individuals last year. It had 2 times the tuition budget. It had 7 times as many employees. And you start going like, is that the future that we're going to have? Or should even states be thinking differently about the educational models that they're making available to their residents? Because so many are not participating in that the way they should be. And so that's going to force us to just accept where we are and start thinking differently about our future rather than buttressing things that are leaving so many out of opportunity. And we do know this. I mean, maybe this is the point I'd end on, is that you've often heard that phrase that talent is universal and opportunity is not. That's actually not true. Talent is universal and opportunity is abundant. And opportunity even gets bigger when more people participate in it. The issue is the bridges and pathways between the talent and that abundant opportunity are not accessible for everyone, and they're not working for everyone. So how do we get more of that universal talent participating in the opportunity? Because as we do, the opportunity is only going to expand. And that's true in so many different dimensions. And that's the reality, is like we can't sit around and feel comfortable that what we have with selective admissions, with faculty-centered models, with the budget state-supported public systems that we have, is like these worked really well for those who are privileged. It's not working well for everyone. So how do we start thinking differently about that?
Awesome. I think that's a great thought to end on. I just want to thank Scott for joining us today, for making the trip here to Texas. And I will turn this back over to Becky and the IDEO team. So thank you.